The Subcommittee on Oceans, Atmospheres, Fisheries, and the Coast Guard will now come to order. Today's hearing will focus on the readiness of the U.S. Coast Guard, specifically how a string of recent natural disasters have affected our nation's only multi-mission military force's ability to continue operations at such a high tempo. Although the Coast Guard is the nation's smallest military branch, and as I'm sure the Commandant can attest, it is definitely a military branch of the U.S. military. It's an organization that clearly punches above its weight class. As we sit here today, the women and men of the U.S. Coast Guard are deployed across the globe, throughout our country, from the Arctic to the Persian Gulf and everywhere in between. The recent hurricanes that have made landfall this year have significantly stretched the Coast Guard's service capabilities. In these three disasters alone, the Coast Guard has rescued over 11,000 Americans, utilizing 95 aircraft, 55 cutters, 129 rescue craft, and mobilized almost 3,000 additional personnel. This tremendous effort comes at a cost measured in dollars, maintenance hours, and personnel. Coast Guard rotary wing aircraft alone flew almost 1,600 hours, over double the total programmed annual hours for a Jayhawk helicopter, and almost 4 times the annual programmed hours for a single DoD equivalent Black Hawk series aircraft. The initial cost estimate to the Coast Guard for storm preparation, search and rescue, and infrastructure reconstructions is approximately $1 billion. That is another reason why we need to move the Coast Guard Reauthorization Act that the Commerce Committee favorably voted out of the committee in a bipartisan way several months ago. The Coast Guard's assets are spread thin, but likely nowhere more so than in the vast areas of my home state of Alaska. There are places where the Coast Guard often has the only available assets capable of providing life-saving medical transportation and service that the majority of the lower 48 states often take for granted, and even these assets of the Coast Guard are often hours and hundreds of miles away from constituents of mine in Alaska. I had the privilege of accompanying Admiral Zunkoff earlier this summer on a trip throughout Alaska, in particular a trip to King Cove, a community on the western tip of the Alaskan Peninsula. King Cove is a robust fishing community and, like much else of Alaska, is accessible only by air and sea. Emergency medical transportation is very challenging, and this is especially true during severe weather, which restricts accessibility of King Cove's local airstrip over 100 days a year. Nearby the community, though, is Cold Bay, which has one of the longest runways in Alaska, one of the longest runways in the country, which is rarely closed and is capable of handling large jet aircraft. As a matter of fact, the Commandant and I actually saw a divert FedEx aircraft landing at King Cove when we were out at Cold Bay when we were out there. Despite only a few miles apart, there's no road access to Cold Bay from King Cove, leaving the U.S. Coast Guard as the only alternative to evacuate patients during inclement weather, which, as I said, is often. These Coast Guard assets are normally dispatched from Kodiak, over 500 miles away, the closest air station, and costs the Coast Guard and the taxpayer as much as $210,000 per trip. As a result, the City of King Cove, Aleutians East Borough, the local tribal entities, and others have long sought a simple 11-mile, one-lane gravel emergency use road that would connect these communities. In 2009, Congress and former President Obama signed into law legislation that authored a land exchange and construction of the road. This legislation would have seen the state of Alaska and various Alaska Native entities add 56,000 acres of land to the Eisenbach National Wildlife Refuge in exchange for just 206 acres in the ability to construct this road. However, on December 23, 2013, former Secretary of Interior Sally Jewell callously denied this exchange and blocked the road. what we called in Alaska the lump of coal on Christmas Eve from Sally Jewell. I strongly oppose Secretary Jewell's decision, as I believe the safety of the inhabitants of King Cove is paramount to other interests. No community in America should be deprived access to necessary emergency care, and senators from the lower 48 would have howled at something this outrageous. In the 5 years since that proposal was blocked, almost 70 medevacs have taken place out of King Cove, a significant portion of which were conducted by the U.S. Coast Guard. And as the Commandant mentioned in this hearing room almost 3 years ago, this is more than a financial cost to these rescue missions. There is a very real cost of risk that this is not a benign operating environment at all, some of the most dangerous weather in the world. As it stands, we are allocating the Coast Guard very finite resources and risking the lives of the brave men and women in the Coast Guard on a problem that could easily be mitigated by a simple 11-mile road. That would solve this problem and provide the peace of mind and basic access to emergency medical treatment for the residents of King Cove. One of the residents whose life was saved by the Coast Guard medevac is here with us today. We look forward to her testimony, and I want to thank all our witnesses for being here, many of whom traveled thousands of miles from Alaska. And of course, it's always great to have the Commandant of the Coast Guard here as well to testify on our first panel. I now recognize my friend and colleague, Senator Peters, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Admiral Zukov. It's great to see you here. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all of Team Coast Guard for your endless hard work responsibilities to numerous different incidents and natural disasters. As we also, over the past few months, the Coast Guard's response to the hurricanes that ravaged the Gulf Coast, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands was nothing less, and I think continues to be, outstanding, and certainly our thanks go out to all of the men and women of the Coast Guard for those outstanding efforts. I am looking forward to learning more today about the Coast Guard's response capabilities and how we can help you maintain your readiness standards. The Coast Guard, made up of just 88,000 personnel, is multi-mission. There are 11 different missions put the Coast Guard in every region of our nation and give them presence all around the world. Even after an unusually active hurricane season, the Coast Guard's duties do not let up. Yes, winter is coming, as we talked about before the hearing, and I want to emphasize that the Coast Guard's missions will not stop because the weather is getting colder. While we don't have hurricanes in the state of Michigan, we do have a lot of bad weather as well, and many times some of the worst storms hit during the winter, and the challenge of ice becomes great. In recent years, the Great Lakes have seen record levels of ice cover, threatening to interrupt commercial shipping that is vital to the Michigan economy. We need the continuous ice-breaking support in the winter months provided by the Coast Guard to keep our ports, cities, and towns open for business. Keeping commerce moving is vital to our nation's economy. The Coast Guard also has a vital role in keeping the Great Lakes pristine. The Coast Guard's mission includes marine environmental protection. MEP is essential to the Great Lakes and most critical at the Straits of Mackinac, where a 64-year-old oil pipeline runs along the bottom across a 5-mile stretch of water connecting Lake Huron with Lake Michigan. According to a University of Michigan study, the Straits are the worst possible location across the Great Lakes for an oil pipeline and the potential for a spill or leak under them. Despite the challenge, the Coast Guard works hard to be prepared just in case the worst happens there, and I look forward to working with you, Commandant, to further increase our readiness. We ask a lot of our Coast Guard. Their 11 missions protect our people, our waters, and our nation, but if we are not careful, we could end up hurting, not helping, the men and women who make up the Coast Guard. If we do not ensure that service members have the right equipment, if we do not ensure that they are being taken care of in terms of retirement and medical benefits, then we are not doing our job. Back in March, I was part of a bipartisan group of senators that prevented the administration from cutting the Coast Guard's budget by $1.3 billion. And I'm proud of that accomplishment, but it is not enough. The Coast Guard needs to recapitalize its assets and improve its shore facilities and military housing in order to continue to do the hard job that we ask them to do. We cannot expect the Coast Guard to be always ready if the service is not able to repair its infrastructure or give its members the best equipment that they need to carry out their missions safely and successfully. Admiral, as we close in on 2018, which will bring your last few months to lead the Coast Guard, I hope that today's hearing will allow for a very direct and frank conversation about the Coast Guard's response capabilities and your needs and how we can help you meet those needs. Thank you, Admiral.
Thank you, Senator Peters. And we have the ranking member of the full Commerce Committee here, Senator Nelson, who I know is a big fan of the Coast Guard. And Senator Nelson, sir, if you'd like to say a few words at the outset, you're more than welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Peters, for the two of you leading this important subcommittee. And I'm here in my capacity as a cheerleader for the Coast Guard because it's the nightly news every night. As you two have already pointed out, what we hear on the nightly local news, that the Coast Guard has done another heroic act, and let me tell you about what they did yesterday. Here it is. Officials seized $300 million worth of heroin, cocaine from Mexico and Central America. And they brought this into Port Everglades. It is 10 tons of cocaine and more than 50 pounds of heroin. And the Coast Guard cutters seized these vessels in the waters off of Mexico and Central America. I've been with the Commandant as we have been in a Coast Guard go fast. And this go fast, you can't believe how fast they go following the bad guy in a go fast. Or I've been in the helicopter as they're showing me how the Coastie is perched in the side of the open door of the helicopter, and with his high-powered rifle, he is shooting out the engine of the Go Fast, who's trying to get away, that, of course, they can't get away, and they stop them dead in the water and then seize all of the illegal drugs. And you can imagine that this is just one of the many seizures of drugs. By the way, the Navy in Alaska, as you know, Senator Sullivan, has pretty well ceded the waters for the Coast Guard, the waters of Alaska for the Coast Guard to protect, in addition to it doing all of its civilian role of protection of the fishing fleet. Well, that's pretty much the case down in the Caribbean, too. Although when we have military vessels down there, they're in coordinating, but they don't have the law enforcement capability that the Coast Guard has, so they call the Coast Guard to go in and seize the bad guy and get the drugs. And of course, here's a big one that happened just yesterday. And so I would just finish by saying, Admiral, I'm so proud of you and all the Coasties. And now, here's another one that you've been doing all the repair work and the rescues after the hurricanes in Puerto Rico and all of the critical response work that the Coast Guard has done in and around Florida, but especially down in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. They saved over 11,000 lives and 1,500 pets while responding to these hurricanes. Helicopters deployed to one hurricane and flew over 1,500 hours, more than double the annual program flight hours for one aircraft. And they stepped it up when we needed them most, and that's what all is happening. The Helicopter Interdiction Technical Squadron, which celebrated its 500th Go Fast interdiction this year, the crews prevented over $3 billion worth of drugs from entering the U.S. So you can see that the Coast Guard is doing its duty every day, and it's not just in these waters represented here, Alaska, the Great Lakes, and the Caribbean and Florida, but it's all over the world that the Coast Guard is doing the job. So I know what you need is the resources, and we're going to try to provide it for you, Admiral. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, we have a little thing called a tax bill that is being marked up in the Finance Committee. It's now become a health care bill. With your permission, I'm going to go back to that markup.
Without objection. Well, Admiral, welcome, and the floor is yours for a 5-minute opening statement, and we will, of course, include a longer written statement in the record if you so desire.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, ranking members, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. I thank you for supporting your United States Coast Guard, and I ask that my written statement be entered into the record.
Without objection.
The Coast Guard offers a unique and enduring value to the nation. We are first and foremost, as you mentioned, Chairman, an armed service with broad law enforcement authorities that span the globe, and a service that is called upon time and again during natural and man-made disasters. We are a flat organization with a bias for action that enables us to surge the entire Coast Guard when our nation is threatened with disaster. This agility was applied during Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and culminated in the rescue of over 11,000 people and, yes, 1,500 pets, while restoring our ports and waterways and correcting over 1,200 damaged aids to navigation and directing the removal of over 3,600 damaged or sunken vessels from the marine environment. This was truly an all-hands-on-deck campaign that drew Coast Guard personnel and assets from across the nation, but it came with several costs. The first cost was readiness, and the Coast Guard used resources well above planned rates, canceled depot-level maintenance on cutters and aircraft, and terminated training investments in our most important resource, our people. The second cost is opportunity cost. Cutters and aircraft were taken away from search and rescue, counter-drug, and security operations in order to save lives, restore affected waterways, and deliver critical disaster relief supplies and equipment to impacted areas. Nowhere was this more profound than in the Eastern Pacific. And the transnational criminal organizations were benefactors of our diminished presence at a time when over 60,000 Americans perish each year from drug overdoses. And the third cost is a real cost. And based on Harvey, Irma, and Maria alone, we need nearly $1 billion to rebuild damaged infrastructure and restore eroded readiness. Of the three categories, this is my greatest concern. It is compounded by outstanding bills from previous events. In particular, the Coast Guard incurred over $90 million in damages from Hurricane Matthew, yet supplemental relief was diminished to $15 million, and we have units operating out of makeshift piers that have not been hardened to withstand any kind of significant weather. So given the many competing demands in our country today and the propensity to fix only what is broken, I am concerned the Coast Guard will continue to be known solely for our success and not what we need to be made whole. As a military service, only 4% of my budget is funded through what is called defense discretionary appropriations. The other 96% are non-defense, and I must compete with every other federal discretionary account to fund a broad array of missions that span the globe and have not diminished over time. Ironically, 40% of the Coast Guard's major cutter fleet acquired, maintained, and operated non-defense discretionary dollars are serving today under the operational command of a Department of Defense geographic combatant commander around the globe. For the past 5 years, we have been funded below the Budget Control Act floor as the other armed services lament the prospect of even being funded at the BCA base. The Coast Guard, an armed service, is contending with identical readiness challenges, yet is funded below the BCA floor, in the basement, if you will. So going forward, we require 5% annualized growth in our operations and maintenance account and a floor of $2 billion minimum to our acquisition account. This would allow me to dig out of the Budget Control Act basement, sustain operations, grow our workforce, while also building out our modernized fleet and reduce our $1.6 billion shore infrastructure backlog. I am truly honored to lead the world's best Coast Guard, but without a stable and predictable increase in our annual funding, I will have to continue to defer such critical initiatives. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Admiral, and thank you and the men and women of the Coast Guard for your exceptional service to our country. I agree 100%. It is the world's best Coast Guard, by far. There's no doubt about that. Let me just ask a quick question off the top. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we have passed in a very strong bipartisan manner out of this committee several months ago the Coast Guard Authorization Act. How important it is for us to take action here in the Senate and get that passed so we can get it signed by the President.
Absolutely critical, and again, I support the work of this committee to make that a reality. And so you have my ardent support to press on. Thank you.
Good. We will continue to press that. You know, I mentioned, and we have pictures here from King Cove and Cold Bay. You and I were out there this summer. Thank you again for visiting our great state. It was actually, ironically, a beautiful, crystal clear day, which, as you know, normally that's not the case out there. Some of the most severe weather literally in the world. And as you noted when we've discussed this previously, the real costs beyond finances, which are quite significant for the rescue missions that you conduct out there, are the costs associated with the risks to the men and women in the Coast Guard who fly in that weather to save lives. Can you talk about that a little bit more, given your experience, and would a road between King Cove and Cold Bay, as I mentioned in my opening statement, help you and your service better respond to these emergency rescue missions that again, the men and women you lead undertake these? Matter of fact, when you and I were out there, they were conducting a rescue mission off a fishing vessel. Just how much that would help in terms of costs, but also risks to the lives of the men and women, the brave men and women who you lead.
Chairman, I sincerely appreciate your leadership on this very critical issue that is not widely known in the 48 contiguous states. This is not a benign operating environment, as you well know, and as the residents of King Cove only know too well. It's been over 5 years since I have had to make a phone call to the family members of an aircrew whose loved one was killed in the conduct of doing Coast Guard operations. We lost one of these very same helicopters during the rescue of Selendang AU. Our aircrew all survived, but the rescuers, the folks we rescued, did not. We owe it first and foremost to the residents of King Cove. And secondarily, this is a high-risk evolution. It is not benign. You and I saw this 11-mile stretch. This is very attainable at a very moderate cost, but you can't put a dollar sign on a life. To a community that this is not a highly trafficked area to begin with, so I cannot foot stomp loud enough the criticality of building out this 11-mile stretch of road and provide the lifeline that this community needs to higher level health care.
I think that's a great point. You can't put a dollar sign on a life, whether it's a life of an Alaskan resident in King Cove, and we're going to hear about that more in the second panel, or a life of a brave young man or woman serving in the Coast Guard. So I take it you fully support finalizing this road, making it happen once and for all, and saving lives and saving money.
I do.
Thank you. One other issue I wanted to mention, and it's something that you and I, Senator Peters, a number of us have been talking about, is with regard to icebreakers. And it's good to see my colleague, Senator Wicker, here. But one disappointment, a number of us serve on the Armed Services Committee as well, and one disappointment in the NDAA conference report is that it authorizes the procurement of one new icebreaker, but then caps the availability of DoD funds for icebreaker acquisition. Senator Wicker and I are going to be soon having a joint hearing, relatively soon, of this committee, this subcommittee, and the Armed Services Sea Power Subcommittee, which Senator Wicker chairs, on this broader issue of icebreakers and how important they are to the national security of our nation, but how there's been, to be perfectly honest, a bureaucratic, I don't know how you want to describe it, fight between the Coast Guard, the Navy, the different committees in the Congress on how to actually procure, pay for these critical assets. I had the opportunity to go out on the two current heavy icebreakers, home ported in Seattle, and the men and women do a great job there. But those ships were commissioned in the early 70s, and to be honest, I don't think the men and women who wear the uniform of the United States should be deploying on such old and decrepit icebreakers. The Russians have 40, they're building 13 more, several of which are nuclear powered. We have 2 heavies, one is broken. I think it's a disgrace. Can you talk more to the national security need of icebreakers and recommendations to this body of what we need to do to jumpstart the procurement and building of these icebreakers?
Absolutely, Chairman. And let me just provide the strategic context for this. Russia has claimed the Northern Sea Route as their internal waters. They've laid a claim for a good portion of the Arctic Ocean through the procedures under the Law of the Sea Convention. And this is a part of the world where we know that there are rich resources, oil, gas, minerals on the seafloor. And don't take your eye off of China either. China is delivering a second icebreaker. China is very active in Antarctica. The treaty in Antarctica, as it expires, I would not be surprised if China looks to extract resources from Antarctica. And now you've got a land grab going on in some of these locations. And if you are virtually there, you are absolutely absent. And so having presence to exert our national security interest is critical. And you need to do it from the surface of the ocean. You cannot do it under the sea, which is why we need to make these investments. As sea ice retreats, we're seeing more and more human activity. We're seeing northern migration of fish at a point in time where fish stocks are under strain. And then there's a military component. Russia will deliver 2 icebreaking corvettes on or about 2020 that will have cruise missiles on them, and we have no surface capability to even monitor that activity or to counter it if that were to be necessary. So we talk about $1 billion, and I'm confident we can build an icebreaker. We have a great working relationship with Navy shipbuilding. We have an integrated program office. We've awarded 5 shipyards to go out and do industry studies, and they are well along their way to submit bids on a proposal this next year so we can get the first heavy icebreaker in the water by 2023. We need to look at block buys beyond that first one. There will be cost with the lead ship because we have not built a heavy icebreaker in 40 years. The technology investments a shipyard will have to make up front, but they will want some certainty that we're going to build more than one icebreaker. We look at carrier strike groups as strategic assets. We need to look at icebreakers in the very same realm, and these are strategic assets, and quite honestly, we're about out of them, and we have abdicated the strategic game of chess to other potential adversaries in the high latitudes.
Great. Thank you for that very powerful testimony. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Admiral, for your service and for all the men and women of the Coast Guard who do an outstanding job each and every day. I want to expand on this discussion on icebreakers. I share Chairman Sullivan's concern about heavy icebreakers in the polar region, and Senator Wicker as well. I serve on the Armed Services Committee with both these gentlemen as well, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure you have the resources that you need in the Arctic region. There's no question that's of strategic importance to our country. But we also have icebreaking needs in the Great Lakes as well that you and I have talked about. And you stated back in March that in your testimony then that the 140-foot icebreaking tugs have been extended for a few years, but there's a finite life on those. The Great Lakes have, in some recent years, have experienced unprecedented ice cover, and as you're well aware, that is about economic security for our country to make sure that we're moving material to the plants and the heavy materials necessary for manufacturing to occur here in North America. in addition to your statutory requirement to keep those lanes open as well during ice cover. Could you expand on your comments regarding icebreakers to include the Great Lakes and how important it is that we recapitalize that fleet as well?
Yes, sir, Senator. We're making great strides in extending the service life on those 140-foot ice-breaking tugs that are doing great work up in the Great Lakes. We had a bit of a reprieve these last 2 ice seasons, so we're not putting additional wear and tear. So we're coming back on step, but that only buys us about 10 years. We're going to have to recapitalize that 140-foot fleet. And look at Parent Craft Designs. I was out in Helsinki a week ago to see what Finland is building. Very capable, using azipods instead of propellers, and looking at what the state of the art is in terms of ice breaking. So as we look at those ships timing out, there's better capability, and those ships do one thing, and they do one thing only. They break ice. And the same thing in Finland. They do one thing and they break ice. There are some great Parent Craft designs, and so we build out our 20-year capital investment plan. We need to look at those 140-foot ice-breaking tugs having much more capability than the ships that we have in our inventory right now. The good news is, for a very modest cost, this can deliver up to the same capability of our Great Lake icebreaker, the Mackinac. So that's what we're looking in the out years as we have bought ourselves some time with our service life extension program.
Although it's bought us some time, what is the critical timeline? When do we need to make these decisions?
We're probably talking 2030 and beyond.
When they come into service, 2030?
When we'll have to, again, that'll be condition-based on, it'll vary one ice season to the next. But conservatively speaking, 2030, we need to start looking at design work and looking at a modernization program.
Also, Admiral, back in March, we discussed the concerns about oil in freshwater, and given the fact that the Coast Guard has primary responsibility to oversee cleanup, and the concern that I have and many folks in my state have regarding an oil spill, particularly in the Straits of Mackinac, and the devastating impact that would have on the lakes, and also the fact that we don't have a whole lot of research into how we clean up freshwater. We have a great body of work in terms of salt water. We have a lot of proven techniques to clean it up in salt water, and salt water has the advantage of having microorganisms that actually break down oil that do not exist in freshwater. So it creates a tremendous challenge for cleanup. Since we talked in March, could you give me an update on the research being done at the Coast Guard to deal with freshwater spills? And what do we need? What additional resources do you need? Because in March you mentioned you were not comfortable that we could clean up a major spill in the Great Lakes now, given current state of resources. What do you need, and how concerned are you?
Yeah. I can't put a dollar figure on it, but we do need to make further investments in our research and development. We did receive a significant plus-up this last year, but that was to address unmanned aerial systems or remotely piloted systems, if you will. We are paying very close attention to 2 anomalies when it comes to oil spill recovery. Oil in an iced environment, and then tar sand that has the specific gravity of water and it sinks, and then how do you recover that? We're using a facility in Leonardo, New Jersey. It's a several hundred-yard long tank that you could actually spill oil in. You can use different water, you can use fresh salt, you can freeze it. So we've been using that facility to do proof of concept work. We recognize that there are research labs and subject matter experts in the Great Lakes, and so if we're going to do research and development, as we look at our area contingency plans, in an oil spill, all things are local. And so we need to make sure that we have full inclusiveness with subject matter experts who are very familiar with this. You've got water intakes, drinking water for communities and the like. What is, do you use a dispersant or not, and what are the harmful effects of doing that? So there's still a lot of science that needs to be done. And meanwhile, we have pipelines crossing the lakes. I would go on the record to say that the Coast Guard is not semper paratus for a major pipeline oil spill in the Greater Lakes. More science needs to be done in that regard, and I know you understand that quite well.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Senator Wicker.
All right. Now, Mr. Chairman, I understand you'd like for me first to mention how delighted we are that Mr. Smithson of Mississippi is going to be with us for the second panel. So I'll take a moment to do that.
And we will
At your
not,
suggestion.
we will not take that from your precious 5 minutes.
Thank
of
you.
Questioning of the Commandant.
I do appreciate it. Well, in the second panel, we're delighted to have Mr. Lee Smithson. He possesses a wealth of experience and expertise in hurricane preparedness, disaster response, and community resilience efforts. He has served more than 3 decades of public service in the U.S. Army, the Mississippi National Guard, and particularly as Mississippi's National Guard Director of Military Support. During his time in the National Guard, Mr. Smithson supported operations for Hurricanes Isidore, Lily, Katrina, Gustav, Ike, and Isaac. So he knows what he's talking about when it comes to hurricane response, in addition to our recovery efforts for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. He is currently Executive Director of the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency. As Director of MEMA, Mr. Smithson coordinates all activities within our local communities to save lives, protect property, and reduce suffering for those citizens impacted by disasters. So we're delighted that he's here and that he'll be part of the expertise for our second panel. And I appreciate you indulging me on that because, as the chair knows, we are back and forth between 2 hearings at the present time. Now, let me just follow up, Admiral, on icebreakers. I'm learning there are icebreakers and then there are icebreakers. Now, there's sort of a notion going around that some of our allies can build a pretty good icebreaker for $200 million, and why aren't we doing that? I think you were explaining to me earlier in a private conversation that the kind of icebreaker that we've authorized in the NDAA is far more complicated than that and gives us a lot more capabilities. So if you would tell us what this almost billion-dollar icebreaker is capable of doing, and how many of those we need, and how many of these less capable vessels we need.
Thank you, Senator. So I was in Finland, and they're one of the offerers, if you will, for icebreakers. I'm of the mind that our U.S. shipyards can build this, and we can build this with U.S. steel and with U.S. prime movers as well. So, yeah, I would consider this as an investment in our military-industrial complex in our shipyards. And we have 5 U.S. shipyards that have now weighed in to compete to build the first heavy icebreaker. But they will look at other commercial designs rather than.
So that's a heavy icebreaker.
Right.
What capabilities does it give us?
It gives you the ability to break ice up to 21 feet thick. And you might say, well, does that ever happen? Last year, the Polar Star broke through over 80 miles of ice, 14 feet thick. A medium icebreaker would never even make 2 or 3 miles of headway in those icing conditions. So we're still seeing heavy icing, and this was to be able to sustain our mission in Antarctica. In the U.S., if there's an area where the United States leads, it is in the mission in Antarctica. We have a significant vote, but we're seeing China in particular stepping up its presence in Antarctica with less than transparent initiatives going forward of why so much China moving to Antarctica.
Okay, now what could these less expensive Finnish icebreakers not do for us that this heavy icebreaker will be able to do?
So when we look at our icebreakers, they do more than...
They help on the Great Lakes?
No, they wouldn't fit through the Sioux locks.
Okay.
No, they're
So we need lighter tugs on the Great Lakes.
so you're limited by the Sioux locks and the width of a ship.
We've got at least 3 kinds we're talking about now.
The main one we're talking right now is the heavy icebreaker. We have a
I'm
medium.
talking about all three, sir.
Okay. Let me take it from the top.
good.
Yeah, the most critical one is our heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star. She's going to leave in a few weeks for Antarctica. If she is beset in ice, the United States has no way to recover that ship. There's nothing in our inventory that can break it loose. We would probably have to ask Russia, can you break us out of the ice, please? I don't want to be put in that position. I don't think our nation wants to find ourselves in that vulnerable situation. We have no self-rescue capability. Our other icebreakers, we have self-rescue capability, but operating in heavy ice, we have one. We are a one-trick pony, and that is it. An icebreaker does more than break ice. It gathers information. It can do law enforcement if necessary and exert sovereign presence. The icebreakers in the Baltic do one thing only, and that's to open up a shipping channel to resupply the ports in the Baltic. A medium icebreaker, less capable. It can break ice up to 8 feet thick. It supports a scientific mission. A lot of the work that Healy did this year, it was a classified program, but working for the Office of Naval Research. So these are multi-mission platforms that can operate in an ice environment.
Okay, well, let's say you and the experts in your field decide we need X number of heavy icebreakers, and we need Y number of smaller, less expensive icebreakers. We can certainly build those at our American shipyards, can we not?
We can.
Okay, but we don't have plans to do so at this point.
We do. So there's $150 million in the 2017 appropriation. We have 5 shipyards doing industry studies. We'll put a request for proposal.
Or what type of icebreaker?
A heavy icebreaker.
No, I'm asking about plans for the smaller icebreakers.
We won't look at the smaller ones. I'm talking the Great Lake icebreakers. We're over a decade out.
Okay, in the Arctic, our plans are to have one kind of icebreaker and one only. Is that what you're saying? A heavy icebreaker. And we have plans to make one.
We have a high latitude study. It was commissioned over 5 years ago that said we need 6 icebreakers, 3 heavy, 3 medium.
Okay, we could build those 3 mediums in the United States, couldn't we?
Absolutely.
But we don't have plans to do so, do we?
We do.
Okay, and what are those plans?
Well, we need to build our first heavy first. I am scraping money
But
to
what are those plans, though? Even if they're long range?
build the first heavy icebreaker in the water by 2023. Do a block buy to buy 2 more. There's a National Academy of Sciences.
And then and only then, we would look at buying the medium icebreakers. So we really don't have plans to buy 3 smaller, less expensive icebreakers, do we?
Let's make sure we're talking heavy, medium, and then we have 3 different icebreakers.
Okay,
We're
well,
just
let's not talk about
heavy-
Great Lakes right now.
Okay, so
I think I'm asking, Mr. Chairman, about whether we have any plans to build beyond the 3 heavy icebreakers that you've talked about. Do we have any plans to use our American shipyards to build medium icebreakers?
We do.
Or is that just a notion down there?
No.
Okay, what are those specific plans? I ask again.
3 heavy and 3 medium icebreakers. And we've been in a decade-long battle to get $150 million that doesn't even build 1 icebreaker. So I can't tell you when I'm going to get the funding to build out this fleet, but we need a fleet of 6 icebreakers. I need an appropriation to do that. If I have a floor of $2 billion in my acquisition budget, I can move on with this, but I don't have the money.
Okay, well, we want to be teammates with you on this. And I think we're just, Mr. Chairman, I think we're just scratching the surface. This morning we'll get into this more in detail at the specific hearing. But I
Yes, sir.
appreciate the chair and the ranking member bringing this to the attention of the public and the Coast Guard.
Well, I think this exchange underscores the need for a joint hearing between this committee and the Sea Power Subcommittee that you chair, Senator Wicker, on the Armed Services Committee, and we look forward to doing that sooner rather than later because this is an important issue. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, thank you for being here. Thank you for everything you do, especially in the Pacific. I will not ask about icebreakers, as you might imagine. I understand there's sort of two aspects of being resource constrained. One is what we've talked about, the need for real appropriations, not just for your national security cutters, but for ice breaking and other things. But the other is that even if you got all the money that was needed, you still have to make resource allocation decisions. And I want to ask you about one specific resource allocation that troubles me. And it's very simple. It's that we've got our heavy endurance cutters in the state of Hawaii, and a lot of them actually move east, not west, even though we have IUU, we have territorial issues, and other challenges throughout the Pacific, all the way to the Western Pacific. And we're now using a lot of Coast Guard resources in 14 for drug interdiction. And the basic question I have for you is, if you kind of look at this from the standpoint of stopping drug supply, I think you're getting about 20% of the drugs coming over the water. So that's not bad, but that's not enough. Also, most of the drugs that come into the United States are actually not coming over the water. So it's not that what you're doing is not important, it's just that we're deciding to move Coast Guard resources into this drug fight, and it's at the expense of something else. You know, you have a number of statutory missions, but fighting this drug fight, it seems to me, you know, I guess the question for you is, who makes the decision on resource allocation? When was it made? Because I worry, frankly, that there's institutional inertia, there's a desire to fight that fight, but if we're only getting 20% of the stuff that comes over water, and that's 20% of less than 50% of the total drugs coming into the United States, we're still fighting the 1980s drug war, and in the meantime, everybody across all service branches is worried about presence in the Pacific. You say virtual presence is actual absence, as Harry Harris says. So how do you sort of square this, and what's your thought process, and is there any consideration sort of reevaluating whether this is even the smart thing to do?
Yeah, let me approach that on two different points. Those decisions rest with me. So in 2014, we had unprecedented unaccompanied minors arrive at our border. And the Department of Homeland Security was looking for beds and where do we put these young kids. I looked at why are they leaving. The reason they were leaving is those drugs, they don't come directly to the United States. They land in the tri-border region of El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. I've met with the presidents of all three countries. They are awash in cocaine right now that's destined for the United States. Violent crime has taken off, and so families are putting their kids in the hands of a human smuggler to get out of Dodge, to get to the United States because of this drug problem. In 2014, we knew where 85% of these drug shipments were across the entire ocean, but I only had enough resources to go after 8%. So it became a resource imbalance. We're using that same level of intelligence to look at our 2.2 million square miles of remote EEZs, to look at is there illegal fishing. We partnered with China, with Russia, Japan, Canada. The United States lead an effort, and for 12 years, we've been doing extended patrols in the Western Pacific, Central Pacific to target IUU fishing. One of our buoy tenders, we should probably paint white, that is stationed in Hawaii, they are going out doing these patrols. It's been 6 years with all the intelligence, with the overflights, but we are not seeing the risk of IUU activity. If the risk warranted the resources, we would reallocate resources. But again, as we look at intelligence driving operations, we also have to look at where can we afford to go at risk. And that is one area where we have gone at some degree of risk, but we have not seen the activity to warrant further resources. I will just add, we also work with Admiral Harris, and they do provide naval platforms with Coast Guard law enforcement detachments. We call it the Oceania Maritime Security Initiative, and we're doing quarterly patrols off of Navy platforms instead of Coast Guard ships, because there are no heavy Navy ships in the Eastern Pacific
Right.
today.
Well, listen, I think you make the case persuasively, but I'll just offer this. It is not at all clear to me that we're winning drug war, 1980 style. And we have more and more needs, and I think that the chair and the ranker of the subcommittee, as well as the Sea Power Subcommittee, really have to make maybe some tough decisions about what we're doing with all these resources. I think we're on deck for at least another couple of national security cutters, and we could throw we could throw lots of person hours at this, and we could throw a few cutters from Hawaii at this. I personally would rather see those forward in the Pacific. I'd rather see them do what we think of the Coast Guard to be best at. And I'll just insert for the record a question for you about the status of the C-130Js coming to Hawaii. Thank you.
Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be back and visiting with you. I remember when we met in March, I meant to tell you, and I forgot to do it, so I'll mention it now, that I had occasion just a short while ago to fly an airplane around the world, emulating the flight of Wiley Post. And one of the best times I had was in your shop in Alaska. And in terms of the missions, the search and rescue, the drug addiction, all of that stuff, I really encourage members of this committee and members of the House and Senate. You don't really know what you guys are doing until you go there and see it. So we're going to encourage that to share those experiences. Well, I know that Wicker has been concerned about the icebreakers, and let me voice a concern about another vehicle that we talked about when you were here in March. Now, one of the best kept secrets in America is that we in Oklahoma are navigable. We have an inland waterway that goes all the way to the Port of Catoosa, and we're concerned about the tenders, the river tenders. And the condition of these things. The vessels, we talked about this in March, maintain the navigation aids and the buoys, the marking of the water channels, and the channels must be marked for river barges to safely move, again, the fertilizer, all this stuff that we move around. So at that time, and I know you're working with us because we've been with the Coast Guard talking about this. Give us a status right now in terms of the acquisition strategy of river tenders.
Yes, sir, Senator. We're standing up an acquisition office right now. We have $1 million set aside right now to start looking at design work. These are not high-tech designs. We're working with the Army Corps of Engineers to look at parent craft, very affordable platforms, but the average age of our fleet of inland tenders is 56 years old.
Yeah.
These tenders maintain a waterway highway that moves $4.6 trillion of commodities each and every year. You take that out of inventory, you have now just deprived, our true economic potential. And in many of these ports, these are export commodities that are helping our trade imbalance for a very modest investment. So we are moving out to start recapitalizing this fleet. This will be very appropriation dependent, but we have made the argument and we are ready to move out to recapitalize these old ships.
Because they're not all that expensive. And then the decision still has to be made. Has it been made in terms of new versus renovated?
These are beyond renovation. We've done mitigation work on asbestos, lead abatement, and what really disturbs me as these ships were designed in an era where we did not have mixed genders in the United States Coast Guard.
Yeah.
So most of this fleet cannot accommodate women.
Okay, Admiral, I'm also serve on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I think it was the NDAA 2014, as I recall, that I got some language into the bill to transfer from DOD to the Coast Guard 14 of the C-27J. That's a Spartan aircraft, a smaller one than the C-130. And I thank you for your work to facilitate this transfer, which saves a lot of money. I think we approximated around $500 million was saved as opposed to the alternative. You've made it real clear that these aircraft are instrumental for the Coast Guard to perform its mission, providing maritime surveillance along the maritime borders and enforcing our laws. And I look forward to seeing these aircraft fully operational. But I understand that you are having issues with parts in getting the aircraft missionized, I guess you'd say. What kind of problems are you having?
Just the lack of spare parts, and as we mature this program, we will be able to ramp up the spare parts. Our immediate problem right now is with the simulator. We end up having to send our pilots to Italy to get simulator training. So as a result, most of their training is actually in
Now, we're the
an airframe.
simulation capital of the world in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Are you aware of that?
We are, and in fact, that's where we're looking at
Okay.
to source a Coast Guard-owned simulator.
I'd like to have you come and visit sometime.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for the great work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cantwell.
Admiral, it's great to see you. Thank you for being here. The 2016 Association for Rescue at Sea Gold Medal recipient was someone from Long Beach. They had used one of the 52-foot motor lifeboats as that rescue mission. We only have 4 52-foot motor lifeboats in the entire Coast Guard. 2 are in Washington. So why not, what's the replacement plan here?
We've been using our 47-foot motor lifeboats, which don't have quite the same capability of these old 52 legacy motor lifeboats that
Like
have
what? Like
served.
What don't they have?
They don't have the towing capability, and they're not quite as seaworthy as the 52-footers. So I've been on several of those lifeboats, and great credit to those crews. We've been able to maintain these boats that are probably over 50 years old now, but they continue to have a fairly lengthy service life. But it's the 47 motor lifeboat that has been their replacement that we have sourced. But as you well know, the Pacific Northwest, the graveyard of the Pacific, is probably where we see the most extreme weather conditions. But for the near term, we are still able to maintain and operate those vessels.
What can we do to maintain that fleet, given, as you just said, the 47s don't have that towing capacity, and this is a very prime fishing fleet location for the Pacific Northwest? What can we do? Are you committed to making sure we keep these 52-foot vessels?
Committed that we continue to maintain and operate, but if we reach a point where they're no longer sustainable, parts obsolescence, do we need a re-engine? There's a whole range of options, but we will need something more capable than a 47-foot motor lifeboat for some of the extreme conditions that we have up in the state of Washington.
I agree. That's what I wanted to hear you say. So that the 47s aren't getting the whole job done, and when we look at both the conditions and the flow of traffic and who we're talking about, we want to make sure our fishermen are safe. So thank you so much, Admiral. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Admiral, for your very impressive and dedicated work, and all the men and women who work in the Coast Guard under you and serve our nation with such immense excellence and devotion to duty. You and I have talked about the Coast Guard Museum. The Coast Guard is the only service that has no such museum. It has a awe-inspiring story that should be told. And the proposal, indeed the plan, to put that museum in New London is one that will be a great destination for Connecticut and the nation. It will be an extraordinary tribute to the Coast Guard with that story that will move generations and will inspire them to join the Coast Guard. You and I have talked about the funding, and I am gratified that our private conversations have indicated your very strong commitment to building a Coast Guard museum. That's correct, I hope.
Absolutely, Senator.
And on our watch, so to speak, that is the committees, I hope that we can lead the effort to frame language that makes it clear that none of the federal funding that may be invested, it's an investment, in the museum would come from otherwise necessary operational or capital funding, and very, very clear that that kind of commitment is necessary for the Coast Guard's well-being, because that has to be our priority, and its effective service to our nation.
That's correct.
I want to ask you, if I may, about the issue of sexual assault. And one reason I ask it is that I will leave here within minutes and go to an announcement of the introduction of a bill that would reform the efforts to discipline sexual assault and deter and prevent it in all of our military services. And I know there have been some instances at the Coast Guard Academy and perhaps elsewhere in the Coast Guard. Can you give us your assessment of how the Coast Guard is doing? And I know that the Coast Guard in no way condones or tolerates sexual assault within its ranks.
Senator, we're making progress. So from the RAND survey that was done back in 2014 to latest surveys to present, the prevalence is down nearly 40%. We are seeing more and more victims submitting unrestricted reports that conveys confidence that there will be standards of accountability, that they will not be re-victimized, but it still disturbs me that we still have sexual assault, this behavior occurring in a service that lives by the creed, honor, respect, and devotion to duty.
And I know that at the Coast Guard Academy, you've taken steps to provide counselors and victims advocates and so forth, and I think that kind of service would be helpful to better reporting as well as better discipline.
Yes, sir, Senator. And part of this is, to be an all-inclusive service. Women have filled every capacity in the Coast Guard for over 40 years running now. We have nearly 40% women that comprise the Corps Cadets at the Coast Guard Academy. These will be our future leaders. At the same time, we want to grow a more diverse workforce. And so any intimation of racial bias is equally concerning to me as well, as we look at growing a more diverse cadre of senior leaders in the future of the Coast Guard as well. And we want to lead the way at the Coast Guard Academy, but as you are well aware, we've had several setbacks there.
I want to shift in the small remaining time I have to Puerto Rico. Again, you and I have talked about this situation on a number of occasions. And I know the Coast Guard has performed extraordinary service in delivering food, water, and medicine to parts of the island that have been isolated, as well as in the Virgin Islands, also struck very heavily by Maria and the hurricanes that preceded Maria during this hurricane season. And I understand from you the situation is improving, but the Coast Guard is committed to stay there. You have, I believe you told me, I'm going from memory, about 2,000 men and women on the various bases that are there doing interdiction of drugs and other missions, but have provided invaluable service to the Americans who live in Puerto Rico. And wonder if you could just give us your assessment of how Puerto Rico is doing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Puerto Rico probably was not resilient before Hurricane Maria struck. And I've never, having been to multiple natural disasters, see a hurricane take out an entire Commonwealth. It approached the southeast corner of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. It exited the northwest, and it literally devastated the entire Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, immediately taking out the power grid, communications, very rugged interior, bridges washed out that are now isolated, which is why we're using helicopters to provide medical, water, food, and commodities to those isolated communities. But at the end of the day, this is our home too. Our Coast Guard men, women, and families that come up to nearly 2,000 people, this is their home. We've been active in these communities with elected leaders, and the signal of the Coast Guard's not going to leave there as well. As we've been doing restoration work, we've seen an increase of illegal migration activity, trying to come across the Mona Pass, and we've had several significant drug seizures just to the south of Puerto Rico, perhaps mindful that maybe the Coast Guard is distracted, and they might be able to sneak in a shipment of drugs or illegal migrants. So we're still trying to balance all of that, but right now we're keeping our head above water.
Thank you very much, Commandant. My time has expired. I look forward to continuing our conversation about these issues and others. Thank you. And thank you to, again, thank you to the men and women of the Coast Guard for their extraordinary service and sacrifice for our nation.
Yeah. And let me just go on record, Senator, thank you, and I also want to thank Senator Murphy for your ardent support of our National Museum in New London, Connecticut.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Admiral, I wanted to follow up on the line of questioning that Senator Schatz had started with regard to, it's actually a broader topic, the deployment of and home basing of new assets. We're nearing the end of the Coast Guard's recapitalization process on the National Security Cutter, and having been there with you and former Homeland Security Secretary Kelly at the commissioning of the Monroe, I got a good sense of just how capable those are, the fast response cutters that you're looking to deploy. I know that there's been a lot of focus on this. I just ask that that you involve Congress a little bit more on the deployment of these assets. There's things that we're hearing in Alaska, and I don't want to go into specifics, but maybe 3 new FRCs in one place to help on maintenance, but it might not help with regard to the scope and scale. And the same with the national security cutters, particularly if there's a couple more online. So can I get your commitment that you would work with this committee in particular on, the plan, the ops, the kind of strategic thinking that is going into the home basing and deployment of these assets, as you know, whether it's IUU fishing, as Senator Schatz mentioned, or, extremely increased activity in the Arctic and the migration of fish there. I think we have an important role to play.
You have my commitment on that, Senator. I've spent a lot of time patrolling those waters. The fast response cutter, much more capable than the 110-foot patrol boat it replaces, but it is the tyranny of distance as well. And our concern driving some of these decisions are the out-year expenses.
Yeah.
And so we're dealing with negative growth in our operating expense account, which is why I'm looking for a 5% increase. So we're not making budget-driven decisions. We're making operational decisions to provide the optimal force laydown for the state of Alaska.
No, and look, and I'm certainly focused on Alaska, but other places, Hawaii and other parts. Senator Cantwell was here, Washington State. But I think that's where we can play a really important role, because if some of your decision-making that is going on internally within the Coast Guard is operational or maintenance or a combination of both, and you need to have certainty on accounts, we can help with that in terms of overall making the strategic decisions more viable for the long term, but it's important for all of us to work together to understand your thinking and to know what you need to maximize kind of the reach.
Yes, sir, Chairman, and we will provide full transparency. I will not sign any final document until it's been briefed to you personally.
Excellent. Senator Peters, you have another follow-up?
Just a follow-up before we get to Senator Markey. Admiral, you mentioned, I want to just get back to the Great Lakes and oil cleanup, and your statement that how concerned you are about a major oil spill in the Great Lakes and our ability to clean that up, to understand the dynamics of cleanup in freshwater in particular, where there's a dearth of research as to how to do that. As you're well aware, in the 2017 Coast Guard authorization, which will hopefully be moving quickly, does include the creation of a center of expertise, something you and I have spoken about, work with the Coast Guard, but also realizing resource constraints so that there are innovative ways that we can involve our universities, some private contractors, others that have an interest in it. But if you could talk briefly as to why a center of excellence is important to better understand freshwater cleanup and the dynamics of cleaning up in freshwater, and how it would be important to locate that center near a place that could potentially suffer from a catastrophic oil spill, and having pre-positioned equipment there with people who are trained to use that equipment, as well as how to train in ice cover. You mentioned that in your previous comments. And I know there's been some testing at your research center, which does outstanding work, but some of the skimming techniques and others were not particularly effective in ice. And given ice is a problem not just in Michigan, but in Alaska and all across pipelines all across northern America, if you could speak briefly of why a center of expertise to evaluate freshwater cleanup would be a great aid to this, to our abilities to keep the environment clean, and something as important as the Great Lakes, which provides drinking water for 40 million people.
Yes, sir, Senator. So let me just go back briefly in time, and the reason I said, we would not be semper paratus is you probably recall a pipeline spill in Kalamazoo. It was really in EPA's area of responsibility. We helped in that response as well. A land-based and is difficult in a very expensive oil spill because of the unique aspects of that oil as well. Now you put it in a lake, and now you put ice over a lake, and we do not have the technology to bear. So yes, we need to move out on this. The infrastructure piece, that obviously comes with a bill. So I want to make sure that we don't let that stand in the way of and I think we do need to make this a high priority as we look at more pipelines crossing navigable waterways, and those waters have multiple uses besides just for navigation. Be happy to work with your staff, with your constituents as well, to make sure that we have a strategic way forward of what are we doing to address this. The Finns have some unique capability in removing oil from ice. What is the state of the world technology in addressing some of these very same challenges? And we can address the infrastructure component of that as we go forward as well. But we can't let brick and mortar stand in the way of good science, because right now some of that is lacking.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and Senator Peters, for having this very important hearing. Commandant, thank you for being here. Good to see you again. I just want to say, for the record, that the fishermen of the state of Massachusetts would like to thank the commander of District 1, Admiral Stephen Poulin, for his great work, and everyone in his division for the work and the safety that they provide on a daily basis. On December 20th, 2004, the Northern Edge, a New Bedford-based scallop vessel, sank and 6 fishermen were lost at sea. The Coast Guard conducted a 43-hour search, but only 1 fisherman unfortunately survived. This tragic loss was the worst accident since the tragedy depicted in the famous movie A Perfect Storm, where the Andrea Gale of Gloucester sank in 1991. The sinking of the Northern Edge prompted the Massachusetts-based Fishing Partnership Support Services to create a safety and survival training program to train fishermen on man-overboard procedures, emergency communications, flooding and pump operation, and other skills to be able to act quickly in emergency situations so that these tragedies do not reoccur. These trainings are heavily valued by fishermen and have spread from coast to coast. The safety and survival trainings are life-saving and also save the Coast Guard millions in resources. However, these programs do not have stable funding. They have been appropriated funds, but only on a year-by-year basis, and fishermen need to have the assurance that these programs will be funded every year. The 2-day search for the Northern Edge costs over $1.5 million. While we all agree that the Coast Guard search and rescue missions are essential, we should work to stop these tragic events before they happen. And that's what these training programs are designed to do. Commandant, can you speak to the importance of having safety programs in place
and how having consistent training supported by constant funding would help the Coast Guard's budget.
Senator, you're a strong advocate of prevention, and so we don't have to respond. And so anything that takes us out of the business of having to respond and preventing, providing these mariners with the wherewithal to operate, and again, up off the Grand Banks in the winter times, it's a hazardous operating environment. So it's absolutely critical. It used to be called the deadliest catch in Alaska. But I would say, we've seen more fatalities of late off the Pacific Northwest, but no different. Cold water, extreme weather, and this training, if it saves one life, I said earlier in this hearing, you can't put a dollar value on a life. And I think consistent funding, if it saves lives, is money well spent.
So just moving on, in response to our hearing last March, you stated that only Class II Coast Guard vessels are equipped with naloxone, Narcan, and that Coast Guard commanders are assessing the opioid threat in their local area to identify any high-risk areas, populations, and risk of exposure. Have you identified any high-risk areas, and what are you doing to encourage other classes of Coast Guard vessels to be equipped with Narcan?
Thank you for that question, Senator. We have since moved on, and we are putting this out to all field units in the Coast Guard. Yeah, we have an epidemic on our hands right now, so this is Coast Guard-wide, not one tier of ships. It could be in a fishing fleet, a recreational boater. There's no community that is exempt to this epidemic.
So since March, you have
Yes,
created a program that covers all of those classes?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, excellent. And of course, the Coast Guard can't perform their life-saving work if they can't navigate our nation's rivers and channels and harbors. For some communities in Massachusetts, Essex, Plymouth, Gloucester, Newburyport, the waterways are filling up with so much sand that Coast Guard vessels cannot safely pass. Many of these waterways are federally owned, and it's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers' responsibility to dredge these waterways to ensure the swift and safe passage of ships. Has the backlog of Corps dredging projects harmed the Coast Guard's ability to perform its critical functions?
The Army Corps was a key partner when we reopened numerous ports following this year's hurricane season. And in the interim, we would reset aids to navigation where there was survey work. We knew there was shallow water, but it still allowed ships, boats to safely pass as we remarked waters as they addressed some of those shoaling activities. I can't address what the backlog is in the Army Corps of Engineers, but what I can say is they have been a reliable partner as we look to reconstitute ports.
But from your perspective, it would be better if there were dredging of funding in order to ensure that sand was cleared out so that you could do your job even better.
Certainly, if there's shoaling, absolutely critical for us to be able to carry out our missions.
Thank you. Thank you for your good work and all the people who work for you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Markey, and Admiral, thanks again for your great service. Please pass on from this committee and the rest of the Senate the appreciation that we all have for the great job that the men and women of the Coast Guard are doing for our country.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Ranking Member, Senator Markey, thank you as well.
Great. I would now like to invite the second panel forward. We have a distinguished panel of citizens who have come from all across our country. The first is a constituent of mine, Miss Ada Kuzakin, who is the president of the Agdagook tribe of King Cove. She is a leader in Alaska. She has a compelling story. I believe brought a family member with her and literally came from thousands of miles for this hearing. So Ada, thank you for being here. We have Mr. Lee Smithson, the Executive Director of the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency, and I know that Senator Wicker already spoke of his strong background, and Dr. Guy Meadows from the Michigan Technology University, and Senator Peters is going to say a few words about Dr. Meadows before we begin testimony from each of our witnesses. you know you want to introduce Guy.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Guy Meadows, who is the Director of the Great Lakes Research Center and a research professor for mechanical engineering and engineering mechanics at Michigan Tech. Dr. Meadows has a long history of working in and around the Great Lakes with research interest in geophysical fluid dynamics and with an emphasis on environmental forecasting and experimental hydrodynamics. In September, Dr. Meadows was selected by the Michigan Pipeline Safety Advisory Board to lead a panel of academic experts from around Michigan to develop a risk analysis for the dual pipeline that crosses underneath the Straits of Mackinac. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Meadows, and we all look forward to your testimony. Thank you again.
So each of our witnesses will have 5 minutes for their opening statement. If you wish to submit a longer statement for the record, we will, of course, accept that. We will begin with Ms. Kusikin.
Good morning, Chairman Sullivan, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Etta Kazakin. I'm an Aleut and president of the Ogdow Tribal Council of King Cove, Alaska. I was born and raised and continue to live in King Cove, an isolated community surrounded by spectacular beauty. It is the land of my ancestors. The Aleut people have inhabited the area for more than 4,000 years. King Cove is a tight-knit community and a wonderful place to raise family. My husband and I have 3 beautiful children ranging from 4 to 20 years old. Today I am speaking to you not only as the president of the Ogdow tribe, but as a mother who nearly lost her youngest child and possibly my own life, for if it was not for the courageous men and women of the Coast Guard who came to the rescue, my rescue more than 4.5 years ago. Sorry. Because our community has no hospital or doctor, we must travel 600 miles to Anchorage for most medical procedures. Our local clinic is staffed with wonderful, dedicated employees, but there is only so much the health aides can do with the limited resources. The clinic is unable to handle trauma, heart, and respiratory complications, and childbirth. I am unable to give birth naturally and must have a cesarean section, another complicated beyond the capability of our small clinics. In March of 2013, I went into early labor. Despite my careful plans to travel to Anchorage well ahead of my due date, my baby had plans of her own. Gale force winds were howling that day, and I knew as I waited in the clinic that no flights were going to make it into King Cove. My fears were later confirmed. I was in no condition to attempt to cross the choppy water by boat. My only hope was that the Coast Guard would send a helicopter from Kodiak for me. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to get out, and neither my daughter nor I would be here to tell the story. Thankfully, after waiting several hours, they came. The winds were so strong that the Coast Guard pilots had to maneuver the helicopter carefully so the doors wouldn't blow in. They were able to land safely in Kobe so I could get transported to a medevac plane and flown to Anchorage. I know it's not the job of the Coast Guard to medevac pregnant women, but I thank God every day for their courageous, selfless devotion to the people of Alaska and their willingness to put themselves in harm's way to ensure our safety. It's because of the men and women of the Coast Guard station in Kodiak that my beautiful daughter, Sunny Ray, is alive. Today, she's an energetic 4-year-old, and I cannot imagine life without her. Every time my daughter smiles, I am reminded of how easily things could have turned out differently. Not every story has a happy ending in King Cove. From 1980 to 2003, 18 people have died because of plane crashes during the severe weather or the inability to get timely medical care. Since former Interior Secretary Sally Jewell denied our road on December 2013, there have since been 68 medevacs from King Cove. 17 of those patients were seriously ill or injured and were medevaced by the Coast Guard. I am grateful that all of them, including the Coast Guard personnel, made it out of King Cove safely. Our notorious harsh and unpredictable weather on the Alaska Peninsula means that some Coast Guard medevacs are not only dangerous for the patients, but also for the Coast Guard. At least 30% of the time, flights are delayed or canceled because of gale force winds, snow squalls, or dense fog. Yet, time and time again, the Coast Guard has come to our rescue when no one else would. We are hopeful that in the near future we'll have a single-lane gravel road connecting our isolated community to the nearby all-weather airport, providing a safe and reliable transportation alternative. We have been fighting to have this small road link through the Eisenbach National Refuge for more than 35 years for health, safety, and quality of life reasons. For us, having the peace of mind and knowing that our loved ones will be safe when traveling to and from King Cove means everything to us. Until then, I'd like to once again express my profound gratitude to the men and the women of the U.S. Coast Guard who put their lives on the line day in and day out. Thank you.
Thank you, Etta, for that very powerful testimony and for your willingness to come all the way from Alaska to testify here today. It's very important, and I think your story, which is indicative of so many other stories and what the Coast Guard does, needs to be known in this body, needs to be known. That 11-mile gravel road is denied time and time again, most callously by Sally Jewell the latest time, where they put the lives of birds above the lives of people, whether it's you and your daughter or the brave men and women in the Coast Guard, and it's got to stop. It's outrageous. Nobody in the lower 48, nobody would put up with this. And somehow, for 30 years, we've had to deal with it, and it's ridiculous. And you saw the Commandant agrees 100% with you and me. So thank you. Dr. Meadows.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, I'm Dr. Guy Meadows, and I'm Director of the Great Lakes Research Center at Michigan Technological University in Houghton, Michigan. Our nation's northern coastlines present unique and demanding challenges in marine operations and therefore to the U.S. Coast Guard. Much of the navigable water of Alaskan, Northeast Atlantic states, and the Great Lakes can be classified as icebound seas for some part of the year. For the upper Great Lakes, access through the federal locks at Sault Ste. Marie closes annually from January to March when ice shuts down the commercial shipping of the Great Lakes. During the remainder of the icebound season, it is the responsibility of the, and I quote, U.S. Coast Guard to assist in keeping open to navigation by means of ice-breaking operations, channels, and harbors in accordance with the reasonable demands of commerce. It's from Executive Order 7521 of 1936. The guardians of the Great Lakes, the 6,000 men and women of the 9th District of the Coast Guard, are responsible for the 5 Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and parts of the surrounding states, including 6,700 miles of shoreline and 1,500 miles of the international border with Canada. The inland seas of the Great Lakes are massive natural resources for the United States and Canada. Consider the Great Lakes as inland seas. Strung end-to-end, the Great Lakes would cover most of the U.S. East Coast and continental shelf from Maine to mid-Florida. The Great Lakes forms the largest group of freshwater lakes on Earth by total area and second largest by total volume, containing 21% of the world's surface freshwater supply by volume. The United States are 84% of the surface water supply in North America, and more than 35 million people rely on the Great Lakes for their drinking water, jobs, and their way of life. This number includes 8% of the U.S. population and 32% of the Canadian population. Much of the world's fresh water is threatened by contamination and desertification. The Great Lakes also face toxic and nutrient pollution, invasive species introduction, and habitat and fisheries degradation. Last month, October 24th through 26th, during the Lake Superior storm, the waves along the southern shore reached a height of 28.8 feet, the largest waves ever recorded in the Great Lakes. The federally operated wave and meteorological buoys along the center of the Great Lakes and Michigan Tech's coastal monitoring buoys near shore are registering increases in both the number of storms and their severity. This wave phenomena is not unique to the Great Lakes, but is present along most of the nation's coastline, and throughout these storms, it is U.S. Coast Guard that responds. Oil has spilled in the seas of all 4 of our coastlines. the Atlantic, the Pacific, Gulf of Mexico, and to a much lesser extent in the Great Lakes. Perhaps fortunately, due to the lack of exposure and incidents, the science of oil and oil cleanup in freshwater lakes far behind that of our ocean counterparts. This fact, coupled with the complexities of icebound coasts, provide challenges in disaster preparedness along our Alaskan and Great Lakes coastlines. As ice begins to appear along our icebound coast, research and supply ships, tugs and barges are all become frozen in the harbors and channels. This is true also for the environmental monitoring buoys that at the present level of technology cannot survive a major ice season at sea. When these disasters occur, natural or man-made, it is the Coast Guard that is first to be called and first on the scene, while being scientifically blind to actual environmental conditions of wind, waves, and currents. The U.S. Coast Guard, in partnership with the nation's research universities and federal partners, is capable of developing advanced technologies to reduce the risk and to decrease response times. Surface environmental monitoring buoys can be replaced by underwater sensing platforms that are capable of remaining and providing valuable information through icebound seasons. Unmanned surface and subsurface vehicles can provide valuable on-site information. Full, unmanned, and autonomous surface vessels are currently being used in conjunction with geophysical survey ships in the Gulf of Mexico and offshore of the Alaska coastline. These new technologies hold great promise for advancing the Coast Guard's mission and providing safety for its personnel. If we expect, when needed, the Coast Guard will save lives, enforce the law, operate ports and waterways, we should first invest in their science and technology necessary for the Coast Guard to successfully execute their missions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meadows. Mr. Smithson.
Thank you, Chairman Sullivan, Ranking Member Peters, for allowing me the opportunity to provide you a statement for the record on our nation's Coast Guard. As Senator Wicker said, I'm Lee Smithson, the Director of the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency. I was appointed to this emergency management position after retiring from the Mississippi National Guard, where I served as a colonel and the Director of Military Support. In both of these roles, I have worked with the U.S. Coast Guard on numerous events along the Mississippi Gulf Coast and the Mississippi River. The longest and most notable was from April until late summer 2010 during the BP Deepwater Horizon explosion and subsequent oil spill that devastated the Gulf of Mexico. I was sent by then Governor Haley Barbour to the Mississippi Gulf Coast to assist with the establishment of a unified command post for Deepwater Horizon. From the beginning, Mississippi's relationship with the U.S. Coast Guard, the mandated lead federal agency, had significant challenges. Mississippi responders were well-versed in emergency response operations and the need for an integrated local, state, and federal partnership. This was because of our experiences during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Katrina taught us that the only way to ensure the needs of citizens are served is by close collaboration and a unified approach to all actions. While the Coast Guard was instrumental in Katrina response, especially in New Orleans, they were not the lead federal agency. Deepwater Horizon was different, and the Coast Guard was designated as the federal on-scene coordinator. The lessons we learned during Katrina were the same lessons that the Coast Guard learned during Deepwater Horizon, but it took until the middle of June for the Coast Guard to fully obtain a firm grasp on the need for a unified approach. Now, gentlemen, in the years since the oil spill, it is very apparent that the Coast Guard has worked diligently in establishing a positive rapport with its local, state, and other federal partners. In fact, gentlemen, it is my opinion that no other federal agency has done more to learn the nuances of a unified approach to disaster response and consequence management than the United States Coast Guard. My agency frequently meets with the Coast Guard, and we have conducted numerous joint training exercises ranging from search and rescue operations to a weapon of mass destruction response exercise. In recent years, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has championed the whole of community concept. This concept brings together residents, emergency management officials, organizations, and community leaders, along with government officials, to collectively assess the needs of each community. It is also vital in determining the best ways to organize and strengthen assets, capabilities, capacities, and interests. In Mississippi, we lead the way in our whole-of-community approach with the adage that no one gets left behind. We work hard every day to foster partnerships with our local, state, and federal agencies and organizations to facilitate effective response to and recovery from disasters. When Hurricane Nate struck my state last month, the preparedness and mitigation efforts undertaken since Hurricane Katrina produced no injuries and minimal damage to our coastal communities. Our comprehensive emergency planning with entities like the Coast Guard exemplified our ability to prepare not only the public and their property, but local governments more than 48 hours prior to landfall. There were only 2 rescues that needed to be made during Hurricane Nate, but the coordination with the U.S. Coast Guard in our Operations Center, along with U.S. Coast Guard Sector Mobile and U.S. Coast Guard Sector Lower Mississippi River, had us prepared to do many, many more rescues. In addition, the federal investments in mitigation made since 2005 in Mississippi showed a tremendous return on investment as we saw very little damage to our homes, property, or infrastructure. Gentlemen, I guarantee you, had we not received the federal dollars in mitigation funding post-Katrina, we would have seen tens of millions of dollars in damage caused by Nate. While I'm not here today to discuss budgets, I would like to leave you with this thought. If the Coast Guard had additional resources, my counterparts and I across the nation would be able to have a more direct access to Coast Guard personnel, especially if they were stationed inside our state emergency operations centers. And this is on a daily basis, not just when we have a disaster looming. In the 16 years since the September 11th terrorist attacks on our nation, all too often our leaders have forgotten how important it is to maintain a constant state of readiness. Readiness translates to resources. Our Coast Guard must have highly qualified, motivated, and dedicated service members. Their equipment must be modern and fully functional. As our nation's only multi-role military force, we must have a Coast Guard that can perform each of its missions in a superlative manner. I'm proud of my agency's relationship with the U.S. Coast Guard, and I'm committed to maintaining this rapport. Thank you, gentlemen.
Great. Well, I want to thank all 3 of the witnesses here for your compelling testimony. Ms. Kazakian, I want to begin with you. You know, the Commandant mentioned, and I think your testimony underscored that the whole idea of you can't put a dollar figure on a life, whether it's the life of your daughter or the life of a Coast Guardsman who's doing the rescues. But you also talked about this issue of peace of mind. And can you focus on that a little bit more? I think that, to be perfectly honest, and again, I know I keep emphasizing that, but you know, if you live in a city in the lower 48, you don't have to worry about, you know, getting to the hospital on time, for the most part, to deliver your baby. But in King Cove, that's a worry. The peace of mind element, I think it's really important for this committee to hear about that. Can you expound upon that a little bit, please?
Peace of mind, for an example, right now in King Cove, we're having a great windstorm. When we have windstorms, when we get up in the morning, the first thing we think about is the safety of everybody in town, because we know that if somebody gets hurt, they're not getting out.
So so there's a big windstorm, and we get a lot of windstorms in King Cove.
Right now, it's gusting to 75. I talked to my husband last night, and and that's a normal day. And it is where we choose to live, but
It's a beautiful place.
But when we get up in the morning and the wind is blowing like that, we don't have any peace of mind. If we see the ambulance out, it's heartbreaking to our entire community, because we are very tight-knit, and we know that that person isn't getting out unless we can get them out on a boat blowing 70, and I don't know if anybody's ever seen seas like that, but it's horrendous, and it's scary, or if the Coast Guard can make it in. And there's no peace of mind when it comes to that. And I've raised I have 3 beautiful children, and if they break an arm, for people here, it's just as easy as going to the hospital and getting that taken care of. It's not that easy at home. When they break an arm and it's severe, that means that we've got to find a way to get out.
And can you explain again, because I think in Alaska we understand this issue intuitively, but there's an alternative that can provide a lot more peace of mind, and it's the road, correct?
Yes. Right now we have the only stretch that we are needing to finish is 11 miles.
Yeah. And by the way, you know, previous testimony of the people who oppose this say, oh, it's this area that there's no roads, there's no, you know, I was out there this summer, I flew over it, there's a whole network of roads that already exists within the refuge, right?
Right, and those roads were made by the Army way back when, and they're all over in there.
So the notion that there's no roads in the refuge is
That is
completely
completely
false.
incorrect.
Yeah, and that gets spun by a lot of people who don't want you guys to have, or us to have the road.
No, that is completely incorrect. The Eisenbach is full of roads. And we're just asking to connect a small portion so that we can have health and safety to get our people out if needed.
A gravel road.
Yes, a gravel, a one-lane, non-commercial gravel road.
That can bring literally hundreds of American citizens peace of mind that most Americans wake up and when they see 70-mile-an-hour winds, don't have, the first thought doesn't mean, oh my goodness, I hope my son doesn't break his arm today.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think it's just outrageous that we've spent 30 years trying to deal with this. I'm so glad you're here, and I really, really appreciate your compelling testimony. Mr. Smithson, I want to ask you about, you raise a really good point about kind of interoperability and integration with what you're doing and what the Coast Guard does. Can you talk about where, you've already mentioned in your testimony where you think that that's working well, but where are areas that we can improve and that the Coast Guard can improve, and how can Congress, if at all, help in that kind of interoperability, seamless operations that you seem to have led and done such a good job at in your community?
Well, Senator Sullivan, it all begins with relationships, and I think that that is absolutely key. You know, the first time that I dealt with, at that time, Captain Poulin, who was the commander of Coast Guard Sector Mobile, was after the oil started flowing from the Deepwater Horizon. So one of the biggest issues that we can improve on with regards to interagency operations is to establish those relationships, conduct the joint training exercises, and do those more and more frequently as budgets will allow. So, and again, to get rid of the stovepipes, we've done a very, very good job of doing training exercises with the Coast Guard. And then we'll do an exercise with the National Guard. Then we'll do an exercise with the Department of Homeland Security. But it's absolutely imperative that we pool those resources and conduct joint training assignment, or I'm sorry, joint exercises across the entire spectrum. We've got to tear those stovepipes down, and that saves on resources as well.
So you're very focused on training realistically, so when there's a real-world contingency, you're not learning this for the first time, and you're able to kind of get a sense of what those stovepipes are, break them down during training exercises so you don't have to deal with them in real-world contingencies.
Yes, sir. At the end of the day, it all revolves around preparedness.
Great. That's an excellent example. Thank you. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to the three witnesses. Really outstanding testimony from all three of you, and it's certainly clear from each of the statements that you made how important the Coast Guard is to our country, to the citizens of this nation. Whether it's rescuing folks in very tough weather in Alaska or in 28-foot seas in Lake Superior, or disasters on an oil rig, the Coast Guard always responds. And when I think about life-saving missions in particular, by definition, that's really bad weather when they go out there. It's when no one else wants to go out, and in fact, when folks are out there, they've gotten into serious trouble. And yet the men and women of the Coast Guard saddle up, basically, and go out and take on some pretty difficult jobs. But in addition to that, I want to ask you questions related to this, Dr. Meadows. In addition to the life-saving operations of the Coast Guard, protecting our environment and protecting our resources is a critical part of the Coast Guard mission as well. And we are particularly, both you and I share a concern with the Great Lakes, given the fact that it does provide drinking water for nearly 40 million people, not to mention recreational resources and all of the other great benefits of the Great Lakes, that we have to make sure that we're protecting it for future generations going forward. And I'm particularly concerned about an oil spill there. We heard from the Commandant as to the state of preparedness when it comes to handling freshwater spills, which is not where it should be. We need to do a whole lot more, both from a technological standpoint as well as from basic research as to how oil mixes with fresh water and the challenges associated with that. But I want to, before I give some broader question, I want to drill down a little bit to an issue related to Line 5, which I mentioned in my opening comments, which is the oil pipeline between the Upper and Lower Peninsula. In June, the state of Michigan was owed an analysis on the risk posed by Line 5, but due to conflicts of interest, the original risk analysis had to be discarded, as you're well aware. The Michigan Pipeline Advisory Board has recommended you to lead this new review team that will conduct a thorough analysis of the risk that Line 5 poses to the Great Lakes and to the entire Great Lakes region. So my question to you is, what will go into this risk analysis, and what do we need to do to fully understand the threat that this pipeline poses to the Great Lakes?
Thank you, Senator Peters. As you indicated, the state has asked me to organize state universities to respond to the scope of work that was failed in the first attempt. I'm very happy and proud to report that we have formed our teams. That has been ongoing now for the last couple of months. There are 9 Michigan universities and 2 universities external to the state of Michigan that have contributed highly qualified experts in this area. We have divided ourselves. I'm a seagoing oceanographer, so I spend a lot of time on ships, just as the way a research ship is organized. There will be a chief scientist in each of the 9 areas. There will be a lead person from Michigan Tech in each of those areas to coordinate amongst the areas. It's a total of 41 researchers that will address the issues specified by the state in the scope of work. And the ultimate objective then is to assess the worst case scenario, to use advanced computing capabilities that we have at Michigan Tech to determine the fate and transport of that worst case spill, and then to assess all impacts of that financially as well as on the people of the Great Lakes. I'm proud also to report that the Ann Arbor NOAA Laboratory, the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, is contributing 2 people from their hydrodynamic team to assist with that numerical computations. And the university has set aside, Michigan Tech University, has set aside a significant portion of their supercomputer cluster so that we can do those calculations at great resolution and with great fidelity.
Well, Dr. Meadows, as you know, and I mentioned this to the Commandant, in the Coast Guard authorization bill, we have language to create a national center for expertise that will focus on improving freshwater oil response, which the concept is to bring academic resources, to bring the resources of the Coast Guard, resources from private industry as well together for a center that will look beyond just Line 5, as important as that is, but look at the broader issue of how we deal with freshwater response in all sorts of bodies of fresh water, particularly with this web of pipelines that we have all across the country. Could you speak to the importance of having a national center of expertise and what you think could come out of that?
In my view, that is extremely critical. As I indicated, we are far behind our ocean coasts in this critical area. There are some unique capabilities that exist throughout the Great Lakes, and working with the Coast Guard would be an honor and a privilege to bring this to the Great Lakes. And one of the things about the Great Lakes, they respond exactly the way the ocean do, but we like to say that there's one important difference, and it's that 30-some million people that drink the water. So in many ways, our ability to predict the fate and transport of all types of pollutants in the Great Lakes is advanced more so than on our ocean coasts. And some of the reason is they're enclosed seas, they're bounded, so the boundary conditions are a little bit better. But the other reason is there's been tremendous work in the Great Lakes to be able to accurately predict where nasty things go. So Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit can close down their municipal water intakes. So it is a very important thing for the Great Lakes, and the oil piece has been sorely missed.
Great, thank you.
Great. I just have 2 more follow-up questions. Dr. Meadows, there's been a lot of talk about icebreakers. I think you see Senator Peters and I were highly motivated to get the Coast Guard authorization bill voted on the Senate floor and moved. So this hearing, I think, provides additional motivation for us. A lot of discussion you saw earlier on icebreakers, and some discussion in Senator Peters' testimony about recovering oil from fresh water versus salt water in terms of spills. Can you also talk about how ice complicates the cleanup process or may complicate either in fresh or salt water.
As the comment indicated, the presence of ice makes it almost an impossible situation. And we share with our Alaskan colleagues very, very strong winds, particularly in this time of year. Again, 77 miles an hour is tremendous, and we experienced similar things a few weeks ago. So the difficulty of an icebound coastline with large chunks of ice being tossed around by enormous waves and these very strong winds makes it almost impossible.
Let me ask one other follow-up question for Ms. Kazak. I know you followed very closely, and I mentioned it, and it's notorious in Alaska, the Christmas Eve lump of coal that we received from former Secretary Jewell. And in that, she mentioned that there were alternative methods, alternative avenues, instead of constructing a road, to providing the residents of King Cove safety and peace of mind. Are there? Do you believe there are? Yeah, I don't. I think it's very unconvincing that there are from your testimony. What do you believe on that?
The answer is no. We have looked at them all. Again, we've been doing this for 35 years, so this isn't something new. We have looked at everything. We have looked, any suggestion that was made that made some sense, we tried. We have tried everything, and now we're at the only thing that's left, which is the road, which is what we asked for in the beginning.
So her notion in 2013 that there was an alternative is not accurate.
It is not.
And one that they've talked about for a lot is, well, just get in a boat and hop on over from King Cove to Cold Bay. What's it like to get in a boat when the wind's gusting at 70 miles an hour? Like, what would it be like to get in a boat to do that boat ride today?
It's horrific. For people, you just don't understand when the boat is going straight up and all you see is the sky, because that's how high the boat is flipping up, and when it smacks down, and you got to think if you're sick or injured or you have your children on board, and then that's not even the fun part. The fun part is getting up the 30-foot ladder in Cold Bay that is made of metal when it's icy and windy and you're holding on. It's absolutely terrifying.
So when you were rescued by the Coast Guard, heroically by the members of the Coast Guard, during your pregnancy and delivery, would a boat have been an alternative, like Secretary Jewell implied in her decision? Was that an alternative for you that day?
No, it was not. There would have been no boat big enough to first of all have all the doctors on the boat or anybody that the mid-levels with me to get up to Cold Bay, and then to try to get me up the ladder would be. I just wouldn't have been able to do it. I was in labor. There was no way a boat could have brought me over there. No.
Well, listen, I want to thank all the witnesses again for your testimony, for flying here to Washington to present on, really, as Senator Peters mentioned, these are important anecdotes, more broadly speaking, of the daily heroism that we see in our Coast Guard. And I think you've all witnessed it. We've all witnessed it, but to hear it directly from people who have experienced it, understand it, it's very important and powerful for this committee, and hopefully it's going to bring about an emphasis not only to fix things like the road, but also to make sure we're fully funding and moving forward with our Coast Guard authorization bill that, again, passed out of this committee with strong bipartisan support. So thank you for doing that. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators may submit additional questions for the record. Upon receipt, the witnesses are respectfully requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. And again, I want to thank our witnesses for appearing today. All three of you did an outstanding job. This hearing is adjourned.